The newsagents.
It is Budget Eve. He's making a list, he's checking it twice, he's going to cut your duty or excise. You can barely contain your excitement, I know. Budgets are always weird events. They're one of the punctuation marks of the Westminster year. They get journalists and politicians excited. They become promised land moments for governments lost in the political quicksand. On the whole, most of the public tends to be unmoved. We'll be doing plenty on the economics of that budget tomorrow, but on the politics, in the last 24 hours, the political mood has darkened even more for Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party. A poll out in the Evening Standard on Monday evening showing the Conservative Party at 20 points. 20 points! This is a party which has never, during the era of universal suffrage, got less than 30 points at a general election. It was their lowest polling score since the 1970s. And maybe here is a different reason as to why. The conversation the Conservative Party wants to have, and that which the public craves, has never been further apart. It's Lewis here. Welcome to the Newsagents.
The newsagents.
Right, so later in the show we'll be heading to Washington for the latest from Jon and Emily from Super Tuesday. But first, this poll which has set Westminster alight, Conservative MPs shaking in their boots. A poll from Ipsos, as I say, for the Evening Standard, which shows the Tory party at an historical nadir. The numbers were Labour 46, Conservatives 20, Reform 14. That's the Tories down from 27 points in January with the same pollster. It is their lowest level with Ipsos since they started polling in 1978. So that is lower than under Margaret Thatcher and the poll tax, lower than John Major and Black Wednesday, lower than Theresa May and the Brexit votes which went nowhere, lower than Liz Truss and her self-created financial crisis. It is just one poll, but of course we know the trend, and none of it is good for Sunak. It shows Labour too, basically unaffected by the Gaza turmoil, the omni-shambles of the Rochdale by-election. All the fevered talk of any advantage for the Tories of a Gaza election couldn't be further from the mark. The man who headed up this poll's fieldwork is Kieran Pedley, head of politics at Ipsos. Just run us through the headlines of the polling and also what surprised you about it most?
The headline finding from the poll is that the Conservatives are on 20 points in terms of their voting intention. So we had Labour 27 points ahead on 47, the Conservatives on 20. And the having large Labour leads is not surprising when you follow the polls lately, but probably what is surprising to hear is with the Conservatives being on 20, that is the lowest that Ipsos have ever had them going back to 1978. So the Conservatives have been around 22 points or thereabouts under John Major in the mid-90s. They were at 22 just after Rishi Sunak took over in 2022, but falling as low as 20 is completely unprecedented. And now, any pollster worth their salt will tell you this is just one poll. I like to think I am as well. But it's just one poll, and this might revert to the mean or thereabouts next month and be back in the mid-20s. But I think the fact that the Conservatives are in a position where they can record their lowest ever vote share with a company that's been tracking this for 45 years, since 1978, is very eye-opening.
And of course, even if they do revert back to the mean of the mid-20s, that is still, by any standards, historically, contemporaneously, very, very low for any party, even a party of government of long standing.
Yeah, and I think the big picture here, Lewis, is that we came back to work in January waiting for this comeback in the polls to take place. We knew we were in election year. We're not quite sure when that election will be, and you're waiting to see signs of the Conservatives coming back. But really the big picture, whether the Conservatives are on 20 or 25 or somewhere in between, is that there hasn't been that recovery yet. So I guess all eyes will be on the budget this week to see if there's any sign of that at all. I think the subplot to this, which is just as important, arguably, is Rishi Sunak's personal poll ratings as well. So 73% of the public tell us they're dissatisfied with the job he's doing as Prime Minister, with 19% satisfied. That gives him a net score of minus 54. Now, if that sounds bad, it's because it is. Liz Truss was on minus 51 just before she was ousted in 2022. Gordon Brown was on minus 51 in July of 2008. So, I mean, lots of numbers there. But I think the point is, any other leader might be looking over their shoulder in terms of their actual leadership. But of course, for the Conservatives to change again now would be a fourth Prime Minister in the same Parliament. So we'll have to wait and see on that one.
In terms of actually the building blocks of what remains of the 20 points and the attrition that is taking place on the Conservative poll rating. Who is Sunak and the Conservatives? Who are they continuing to lose over time? Because as you say, the trend is not only a lack of recovery, but they're actually generally declining over time and over the months as we get closer to the general election. Who are they losing and who are they failing to win back?
I mean, the reality is that they're losing everybody. I mean, without being flippant, if you're going from a position where you were 45% or thereabouts in 2019, and you're now in the sort of low 20s, you're losing people across the board. The swings tend to be the largest amongst older groups and amongst Leave voters and so on, because that's where they had the most votes to lose in the first place. But I think the big challenge for the Conservatives is that fact that they're losing people in different directions. So on the one hand, they're losing a good chunk of voters to Reform, but on the other hand, there are direct Conservative to Labour switches. I think the reason for a lot of this is because when you ask the public what their priorities are, there tends to be what I call a big four of healthcare, the economy, the cost of living and immigration. The public don't tend to think they're doing a good job on any of those things. And whilst it's often talked about that there's a lack of enthusiasm for Labour, perhaps so, there's also a lack of hostility to the prospect of a Labour government. And that creates something of a perfect storm at the moment, which you're seeing in the headline polls. Now, of course, things can change between now and election day, whenever that might be. Right now, it looks pretty dire for the Conservatives.
Kieran, isn't it striking, though? You've just said there that your organisation and all of the other pollsters, you all do the same thing. You ask the public what it is they care most about, and they usually come back with more or less the same thing you just mentioned, most of them, the NHS, inflation, the economy, immigration too. Particularly on the first three of those things, isn't it kind of curious that actually the government seems to be saying almost nothing about them? I mean, if you think about our political conversation over the past few weeks, it has been dominated by questions around Islamism, the marches, anti-Semitism. These things may be important in their own ways. We saw Sunak come out in Downing Street on Friday and give his first Downing Street podium speech about it. But actually, it's not part of their problem. It might be that the country is largely indifferent to those problems.
Yeah, so our monthly Ipsos Issues Index asked people what the most important issues are facing the country. And we also asked in our most recent Ipsos Political Monitor what were the most important issues that would affect your vote. And they're largely quite similar. I think there's a lot of conversation in Westminster around the importance of immigration to Conservative voters and to 2019 Conservative voters, which is understandable. These are millions of people and it's an important issue. But what I think is under-discussed is when you ask Labour voters, bear in mind I've just told you 47% in the polls with Ipsos at the moment, what their top five issues are. Immigration doesn't actually feature. The NHS is number one issue by some margin. You've got the cost of living and the economy, but you've also got things like education and housing as well. I think public services in particular are often sort of underplayed. 78% think that the state of public services has got worse in the last 5 years. And my hunch is the reason for this is that people assume that the NHS, for example, is an issue that Labour own. It's always important to the public, and yet Labour lose elections. So how decisive can it really be? But I think what I would stress is right now the severity of the concern amongst the public is a little bit different to what we've seen in previous years. So it will be interesting to see if there's anything else to come back on this in the budget and moving forward, because there is really intense public concern about public services at the moment.
You talk about the budget, Kieran. There is always, there has been basically for the entirety of the Sunak premiership now, there is always a kind of intensity of Westminster chatter whenever there is a so-called quote-unquote set-piece event. The budget is a set-piece event, and everyone says, this is the moment the fight back begins, this is the moment the polling starts to reverse. Is there much evidence ever that these sorts of events like a budget do contribute much or can contribute much to substantial changes in the polls, at least in the short term?
Well, I think the short answer to that is it depends on the nature of the budget. We have to go back a little while, but the so-called omnishambles budget under George Osborne.
But that's not really in a positive direction.
No, of course. That's obviously on a negative sense. But I mean, things can move positively or negatively if you can set the agenda in terms that benefit you. Look, you're right. It's a set-piece event. It's one of the few set-piece events that the Conservatives have left to try and shift the narrative, at least the things they want to talk about, as opposed to events that might batter them hither and thither. But look, I think that when you look at individual budgets, it's not likely that we're going to see a budget announced this week, and then this time next week, we're going to see the poll lead cut in half. But I think what the Conservatives will want to do is to lay those building blocks, as you described it, about what the next election's about, and to try and put Labour on the back foot. Now, they may or may not succeed in that, but ultimately, when you look at the issues, and I've sort of explained earlier, there are different issues that matter to different groups of voters. And so both of the main parties, Labour and the Conservatives, will want to make sure the election is about the issues that they own. And I suppose the budget budget is one example of where the Conservatives can try and move that in their direction. They've not been able to do that yet, so time will tell if they're able to do so.
Well, they want to move it onto a tax-cutting direction, don't they? And this is the sort of gamble, it seems to me, of the Sunak premiership, or the sort of remaining months of this parliament, which is to try and say that we are the party of tax cuts, Labour isn't. The question is, I suppose, to what extent the public are actually receptive to that message, given everything you've just said, which is that the primary concerns are actually about the state of public services. And obviously tax cuts, generally speaking, most people will perceive to be an anathema to substantial improvement in those services.
So I think the interesting thing when you poll public opinion on tax cuts versus public services, you can get different answers depending on how you frame the question. So I think the important point here isn't necessarily that people are sort of binary blocks of voters that are one thing or the other. The cost of living is really, really important to people as well, as I've alluded to earlier. So if the Conservatives can contrive a narrative around tax cuts helping people with the cost of living, maybe that's a message that can help them, particularly with their target voters. I think there are two challenges that are really, really important here. One is the one you've alluded to, which is that public services are so important to voters right now. The NHS is the number one issue. So any tax cuts have to be sold in a way that reassures people the money is there to deal with GP appointments and waiting lists and so on. But the other thing is that tax cuts for, say, national insurance are not in isolation. So we know that council tax, for example, is going to be going up around 5% this year and in future years as well. So when people look at their pocketbook, to use that phrase, and whether they feel better off than a few years ago, they're not just going to look at national insurance. They're going to look at the overall bills, interest rates, if that's relevant to you, if you've got a mortgage, your council tax, and so on and so forth, and then the quality of services that you receive in return. So it's a qualitative feeling about the direction of the country. Right now, that's negative. And right now, around 69% tell us it's time for change at the next election. And I think that, for me, is the number one problem that the Conservatives have. People think it's time for change. So what you've ultimately got to do, if you're the Conservatives, is change the public's mind on it being time for change. It's not easily done once that feeling sets in.
Finally, Kieran, I mean, would you agree with me that this poll, this latest poll, plus the general decline that we've seen elsewhere, it surely means that Sunak is going to try and continue to push the date for the election as far back as possible? There is a sort of feeling in Westminster, or lots of people in Westminster constantly saying, actually, he's going to go for May, lest things get even worse. On the basis of your poll, it's hard to imagine how things get even worse, isn't it? I mean, less than 20 points. I mean, it's surely hard to imagine historically how the Conservatives could fall south of 20.
Well, I am a bit vocal on this, that I can't see the logic of a May election. Yes, most people that respond say, well, it's going to get worse. Hard to see how it can get worse, to your point. You would imagine, and look, I don't know Rishi Sunak personally, I don't know what's in his mind, but you would imagine that someone that is staring imminent defeat in the face right now would like to sort of hold on for that 2-year anniversary, hope something shows up and hope to be able to tell a story of recovery, and also hope that something turns up on the negative side for Labour that sort of plays on some of those doubts that people have. So, common sense to me suggests that it'll probably be in the second half of this year. But given that May is 6 to 8 weeks away, I don't want to be too vociferous on that in case I have egg on my face. But there aren't many examples in history of prime ministers going early when it looks like they're going to lose.
Agreed. Kieran, thanks so much.
Thank you.
I alluded to it there with Kieran, but I think there's a better way of understanding the Conservatives' troubles than just the inevitable attrition of 14 years of government and the chaos of years past. And it isn't talked about enough. And that was, in a way, best summed up by Rishi Sunak's appearance outside Downing Street in a hastily arranged lectern speech after the Galloway victory in the Rochdale by-election last Friday.
Islamist extremists and the far right feed off and embolden each other. They are equally desperate to pretend that their violence is somehow justified, when actually these groups are two sides of the same extremist coin. Neither group, except that change in our country can only come through the peaceful democratic process. Both loathe the pluralist modern country we are. Both want to set Britain against Britain, to weaponise the evils of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred for their own ends. The faith of Islam, peacefully practiced by millions of our...
I've been thinking about that clip a lot. For me, it sums up so much of why the Tory party finds itself in a death spiral. If you look at the polling, as Kieran was saying, you find the public are desperately concerned about public services, about the fabric of the country. And it's not hard to see why. there is a quietly enraging, indeed sometimes radicalizing effect on an individual voter and their voting intentions of repeatedly encountering, in some places, a basically collapsed NHS, a broken housing market, near bankrupt local government, a still sclerotic economy. But are any of these the building blocks of either what the Conservative Party is talking about or what the national political conversation is? No. We hear almost nothing about them. Instead, the terms of trade of our politics, the elite political conversation which ricochets between politicians, newspapers, media organisations and back again, is dominated by matters which are either remote or bewildering to many voters. Matters of symbolism, culture war, or even plain conspiracy have come to obsess the dominant wing of the Conservative Party and the wider media. And that takes us back to the Sunak speech. It was fine as far as it went, albeit about extremism when not addressing the elephant in the room of the extremism of some of his own party. But a speech at 5:30 on a Friday talking about Islamism, about protests, about Gaza and so on, it's not to say these things aren't important, but they are remote to the average voter. Much of the internal Conservative conversation and external politics communicated by its figures over the past week and longer have been dominated by a belief that Islamism is lurking behind every corner. As well as being wrong, most people haven't a clue what it even means. For Sunak, every day not talking about the economy or schools or the NHS or immigration is a day wasted because it's a conversation the voters don't want to have. And I think there is a bigger reason for all of that, which is the most damning of all. To be honest, the Conservative Party prefers to talk about esoteric things, about culture war, symbolism over policy, because frankly, it's run out of things to say about everything else. It's burnt through ideas, governing philosophies at a remarkable rate over the past 14 years. They're intellectually exhausted, but the result is they indulge themselves. They go down rabbit holes, and that is making their political problems worse still. But here's the final thing. It's not just a Conservative problem. Labour, out of office for so long, has very little to show for it in terms of plans or a new approach by comparison to other opposition parties on the precipice of government, say New Labour in 97 or Cameron in 2010. It's a reflection of how deep a hole we're in as a country, how many of the matters are structural, how little money there is or inventiveness about how to raise more, how intellectually exhausted politics overall feels in the wake of perma-crisis. So you end up with politicians gravitating towards matters which are minor or bewildering. In short, the gap, the gulf between the Westminster conversation and what the public want to talk about has never been wider. We will be back with Jon and Emily in the US right after this.
Well, last night there was a rather interesting visitor here at the White House, and that was one Benny Gantz, who you might not have heard of. He's part of the Israeli war cabinet. He's not Netanyahu. In fact, he's probably the person that Netanyahu least wanted to see in the White House. He is seen as the moderate, the man who could possibly move towards a ceasefire deal. And he was in talks with none other than the Vice President, Kamala Harris, who, don't forget, the night before had spoken so passionately about the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza.
And given the immense scale of suffering in Gaza, there must be an immediate ceasefire. For at least the next 6 weeks, which is what is currently on the table. This will get the hostages out and get a significant amount of aid in. This would allow us to build something more enduring, to ensure Israel is secure and to respect the right of the Palestinian people to dignity, freedom, and self-determination.
Look, this is a hugely significant move, whichever way you cut it, because, frankly, it would be normally the Prime Minister who is welcomed into the heart of the White House. Admittedly, Benny Gantz hasn't been meeting the President, but he has been meeting the Vice President. And you feel that the US want to ratchet up the pressure on Netanyahu to accept that more needs to be done, that they need to let more humanitarian aid in, that they need to stop the fighting around Rafah, that they need to change course. And the next step could be that the US calls on Netanyahu to resign, which would be a momentous move in itself.
There is that sense that they're building him up because, just to put Benny Gantz in a bit more context, he is the man most likely to replace Netanyahu if elections were to take place, if things got untenable for Netanyahu. And so there is a sense right now that the White House think that they can perhaps build him up as an opposition. Now, let's not get carried away. Gantz is pretty weak. He doesn't have a strong ideology. Many Israelis would see him as somebody with no particular principle underlying. It's pretty easy to bend, but their best shot at the moment. And he's not as savvy as Bibi. If there's one thing we know about Netanyahu, it's that he's a fighter. He's a street fighter and he's a survivor. Gantz is not like that. But if the Americans see him as somebody who can be bent to their will, and we know, in brackets, what Biden thinks of Netanyahu, he called him, beneath his breath, a son of a bitch. So if this administration thinks that Gantz is the way to a ceasefire, it massively helps them to start to begin to end what is possibly the worst crisis at the moment, but also it might do something at home.
And the domestic angle on this is absolutely critical. It is hard to find anything that Democrats and Republicans agree on. They both agree that Michigan is the vital state and that there is no path to victory for Joe Biden in November unless he wins Michigan. Michigan is the place with the highest Arab American population. The city of Dearborn, just outside Detroit, has the highest concentration of Arab Americans anywhere in the United States. And the majority that Joe Biden won the state with in 2020 is eclipsed by the number of Arab Americans who are there, who could vote. And add to that Ann Arbor, which is the University of Michigan. Across university campuses, the pro-Israel views that you were always able to find in America on college campuses are thin on the ground.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you listen back to that speech from Kamala Harris outside, she sounds really upset. I mean, she sounds really forcefully passionate. If you delve a bit deeper and you say, oh, has policy changed here? Has anything actually changed? It's quite hard to point to the thing that has moved. What seems to have moved is the force of emotion. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment she doesn't feel that. I think it's probably shared by Joe Biden, but it's also very useful to remind particularly young Americans, young progressive Democrats, quite now, that they can see the pain, that we feel what you're seeing as well, because they cannot let young Democrats think they just don't care.
I honestly think the politics has shifted substantially. I mean, you say what's the difference between the policy now and then? That's a great question. But look at the rhetoric. From Joe Biden, after October the 7th, flies to Israel, says we're standing right by you, you've got to do whatever you've got to do. And Kamala Harris saying, no, Israel, you can't just do what you want to do. You've got to care about all those people who are starving, who need food, who need aid, and living under the fear of continual attack. And it was a very, very different
Oh, sure. I mean, over the last 5 months, of
Yeah.
course it's been different. But what I'm saying is, I guess, since they started talking about ceasefires, and don't forget, today was the day that we were meant to have had the ceasefire all sewn up, sorted. You know, it was a week ago that he was talking in that ice cream shop after his appearance with Seth Meyer about a ceasefire taking shape. We would have thought by Tuesday there was something in place. It isn't in place. Partly, they will say that's because Hamas has now revealed it actually doesn't know the whereabouts of some of the hostages. It cannot produce a list of names. Devastating to the families of those who think that this ceasefire has to be some kind of quid pro quo. You have to see results, and that Hamas are playing their part too. And at the moment, I don't think Israel has any confidence that that's happening, and I don't think Joe Biden has any confidence that that will happen. So all they can talk about is a humanitarian aid ceasefire of 6 weeks to get the aid in.
And I just think that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have looked at the polls, whether the raw data in the polls, whether it is focus group polling, they know that among young people and a sizable chunk of the population, attitudes have shifted. All the years I lived in the States, I couldn't believe how much more pro-Israel America was compared to most of the rest of Europe. Yeah. And something has shifted. And that is not going to be easily won back. If you're an Israeli lobbyist, you're going to have your work cut out now, changing attitudes among young people. Biden's got an election to fight. He can't afford to be hemorrhaging any more support. And we can talk about more general polling about Joe Biden, but you can't be careless with what is happening now and the numbers of voters who are abandoning you.
Yeah, and I think it is important that we talk a little bit about Joe Biden, because over the last couple of days we've been focusing on crowd MAGA because we wanted to try and give you a sense of what is going on strategically in terms of Trump's plans for winning voters that he didn't have last time round. When it comes to Biden, the questions are slightly different. This whole issue of age is doggedly following him around. He gave an interview in the last 24 hours to the New Yorker magazine. Now, suffice it to say, that's a print interview, and it was done by his biographer, Evan Osnos. And the only clip we've seen so far from Evan Osnos is him saying, his voice is slightly weaker, a little bit more reedy, but he didn't forget a single name and he made total sense. I would say the problem with that is we haven't seen any video, we haven't seen any evidence, and you keep on relying on sort of surrogates coming out and telling us how well he's doing.
Well, you also have that thing that surrogates coming out and saying, look, I've been in meetings with Joe Biden and he's absolutely in command of all the details, all the facts at his fingertips. He's still got the same determination to drive it through. And you think, OK, well, show us. I mean, if it's that good, show us.
Well, he will, because he has to on Thursday night. Now, for most of the world, anywhere outside America will not probably be staying up to listen to State of the Union. You will. You'll be here. It's not the Super Bowl. But it is the moment where he has to address America as its commander-in-chief. And I think that is a moment for him, isn't it? It's something that, he can't screw up.
Oh, absolutely not. And you have said, I think, on our last podcast, that rarely will a speech have been scrutinised so much for verbal slip-ups, any kind of slip-up whatsoever, any kind of stumbling or fumbling, and people go, it's really bad. You and I were lucky enough to be at a rather prestigious dinner over the weekend where a number of very, very well-connected people to the White House, to Democratic circles, were present. And two things stood out and kind of rocked me slightly. One was they said there is not a cat's chance in hell that Joe Biden is going to pull out before the convention. He is going to be the candidate going into November. And the second thing they said was there is not a chance that he is going to take part in a televised debate with Donald Trump. And they'll say, well, it's because Donald Trump's a crook and Donald Trump's an election denier and there's no point. And
also, he didn't do any of the Republican primaries, I guess you could say.
Exactly.
Why should Biden?
But it will be the first time in 64 years since the first televised debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon that there won't have been televised debates. That will be an astonishing moment, and it will take an incredible amount of spin from the White House to kind of counter the argument, well, he's just running scared. They're too frightened to put Joe Biden up because he's so old and incompetent.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I think it plays into what we know is the sort of the cringe factor. And we'll play you a little bit of Seth Meyers. He did, the late night sort of chat show host, Seth Meyers show, just before the weekend. And by all accounts, it kind of went okay.
You mentioned some classified materials, some documents recently leaked, some classified documents. And this isn't a gotcha show, but I do want to ask about it, that says you are currently 81 years old.
Who the hell told you that?
Yeah.
That's classified.
That's classified. All jokes aside, according to recent polling, this is a real concern for American voters. How do you address that concern going forward as you come up to the 2024 election?
Well, a couple things. Number one, you got to take a look at the other guy. He's about as old as I am, but he can't remember his wife's name.
Yeah.
And number one. Number two, it's about how old your ideas are. Look, I mean, this is a guy who wants to take us back. He wants to take us back on Roe v. Wade. He wants to take us back on a whole range of issues that are 50, 60 years, they've been solid American positions.
But when you talk to people about that, as you say, people very well connected, closely connected to the White House, they say we have to watch kind of, between fingers, slightly edge of your seat, because you just don't know what's going to go well. And that's not a relaxing way. I mean, I remember Barack Obama, who I think just made these kinds of events and shows look like second nature. He would do the Jon Stewart, the Daily Show, and they looked like old friends. He was very practiced. It was very comfortable viewing. You don't want the president somewhere where people are starting to say, oh my God, this is kind of late night on a Friday night and I daren't look. It's not meant to be a horror show. And if that's the image that people close to him are getting, then they won't want him to go out and do more of these. They won't want him to do Super Bowl type occasions. The phrase that was used to us was bubble wrap. We're going to bubble wrap. Now, COVID obviously bubble wrapped Biden for 2020. Very interesting to see if they pull him out of the presidential debates, if they pull him out of any more of that stuff. What you're left with, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, is TikTok. And the Republicans are terrified of Joe Biden on TikTok. They haven't put Trump on TikTok because it doesn't really sit very easily with their whole anti-China, sort of anti-communist agenda. So they're kind of weighing up how they get the publicity that TikTok and the influence that TikTok now affords them versus, the hypocrisy of him playing into it. Biden does do really well on TikTok because he doesn't have to do very much. Those clips are all brilliantly and beautifully curated for him.
And the other thing I keep hearing about how they're going to play Biden and run Biden in the run-up to November is forget big rallies. That's not going to be the thing. He's not going to come on stage to village people.
Right.
He's not going to do a Trump. That's not him. It'll be him with small groups where it's a more empathetic setting where he can talk kind of in a humane terms. They will try and control as much as they can of the clips that get out. And he's just not doing that much because I think there is a terror that the more they expose him to kind of areas where you can make gaffes, he is being judged more harshly. Look, when we were in Richmond, Virginia at the weekend and there was a Trump rally, there were plenty of verbal inexactitudes in what Donald Trump was saying, but he is not judged so harshly.
More than that.
People laugh at that.
Yes, but weirdly, it is a double standard, and I think we have to talk about that double standard because Trump barely makes sense linguistically on stage. You can edit him down, but he barely makes sense from one sentence to another. And he confuses his own wife, and he confuses Nancy Pelosi with Nikki Haley, and he confuses world leaders as well as Biden. So let's not pretend there isn't a double standard. The trouble is, quite simply, that more people in America see it as a problem for Biden than they do for Trump. And I think, to be fair, there is some division, amongst senior Democrats who don't know whether it's better to just get him out, get people used to it. Here he is. We know he's got a thin voice. We know he's an old man, but he's good, but he's fine. He knows his stuff. He gets it all done. Or whether they do the bubble wrap. And I think there's going to be a tension which is as yet unresolved as to which way they go with that. There
was a big poll in the New York Times at the weekend among Democrat voters. 48% think he should run, 43% think he shouldn't. That is a huge number. And on the Trump side, given everything, 97% of the people who voted for Donald Trump in 2020, since when we've had January the 6th, the excuses for it, we've learnt more about the terrible events that took place. We've seen the 91 different criminal charges and a number of separate indictments, and 97% of the voters who voted for Donald Trump in 2020 are going to be there in 2024. In other words, Donald Trump has not been harmed at all by the events of the past 3 or 4 years.
He still didn't win the popular vote, and that's why a lot of the maths that we're doing this time round is trying to work out, I guess, where Donald Trump's ceiling is. If he still has that whole sector of the Republican Party that is the Haley side, will they come across? Will they eventually go to Donald Trump? Or will they say, sod you, we're going to go to Biden because we'll say anything but Trump? Or will they stay at home or write in their own candidates? We were talking to Kurt Volker yesterday on the programme, who's a former NATO ambassador. And I said, did you vote for Donald Trump last time? And he said, no, I voted for John McCain, who is the last Republican nominee that he really respected. John McCain, deceased, dead.
A way of spoiling his ballot.
It's a way of spoiling your ballot,
but making
with
a
respect
point.
And with a point.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are whole heaps of ways that people can express their democratic right and not vote for Trump.
You know, it's hard to be in this town for a few days, as we have been, and not hear the kind of angst and nervousness and concern over having Joe Biden as the candidate going into 24 against Donald Trump. Against that, you hear the Biden loyalists saying, calm down. One, he's got this, and two, look at the elections that have taken place. We did miles better in the midterms than people were predicting. There was a special by-election on Long Island for George Santos's old seat. We absolutely smashed it, knocked it out the park. Whenever abortion has been anywhere near the ballot, which, you know, the Republicans were hoping would be a big vote winner, it's been a massive vote loser for the Republicans. And so, you know, we've got that to play with as well going into 24.
All the elections, all the recent elections actually, have gone Biden's way. So I find this fascinating because you can see the kind of the flicker that comes with the sort of Democrat voice now, which is like, we're fine, we've got this, we're okay, he keeps winning, he's winning. But what if, right? And that's your conundrum in a nutshell.
And like you, like me, each day that passes, Joe Biden is not getting any younger. But Joe Biden, 81, is looking quite old already. And who knows how much it will deteriorate or his position will seem to weaken as those months go on between now and November, because they're going to be tough and they're going to be grueling.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone ever got younger on a US election campaign. It's tough.
Maitlis, you know what we haven't mentioned yet? It's today, it's Tuesday, Super Tuesday.
Yes, everything in US presidential terms has to be big or bigger, and this one is super. In fact, it is so super. It is 16 states, 15 plus American Samoa. It is 5 time zones. It is 800 delegates up for grabs, and we are about to hop on a plane to the pink wonderland of Mar-a-Lago, the Winter Palace.
Because, of course, Donald Trump is going to be proclaiming victory. He won't have got over the line yet. He'll still be pissed off that Nikki Haley refuses to give up the fight. But I think we're going to see a buoyant, boisterous, ebullient Donald Trump tonight at Mar-a-Lago, and we'll be reporting on that on Wednesday's Newsagents.
We'll see you then.
This is The Newsagents.
Before we go, it is an exciting day at Newsagents HQ, or should I say Agents HQ, because we've got an extension to the show. A sister, they say a sister podcast? I suppose on that basis, my sister, Gabby Logan. How do you feel about that, Gabby?
Yeah, I'm loving the family and the communal feel to this.
The communal feel. Sports Agents is out today with Gabby Logan and Mark Chapman. It is out at 5 o'clock today. So once you finish listening to this, and obviously we've got to come first, but then you can go and listen to Sports Agents. And this building is currently all decorated in orange and black, like it's Halloween, in honour of the two of you.
It was quite scary to come in and see my face on a cupcake in reception. It's
like Molyneux.
Very good.
My only sporting reference.
Any
there.
other orange and black sporting outfits?
Orange and black.
Whole kind of
Hull.
golden and black.
Okay.
And got,
yeah, good. Are you excited?
Very excited, because we've done a few pilots, and Mark and I have known each other for a very long time, so we immediately have a certain chemistry that we kind of able to work together, which is great. And you just want to get going on these things, because every day since I've known about this coming, and it's been a few months, there have been stories I've been dying to talk about, but of course they go very quickly. What that did prove to me was the concept that there are so many incredible stories around sport other than just what happens on the field of play. I think we will never be short of material.
So the idea is, in a way, it's not just about what goes on in terms of the kind of matches of sport and whatever.
Yeah,
it's
not never really
like
about
grandstand or something.
No.
Another reference
No.
there. Another reference.
It was decommissioned years ago, but anyway.
Yeah. Oh, that's a shame. They should bring it back. Yeah, but it is about, as much as anything else, what goes behind, as we say on this show, pulling behind the curtain of politics and how the media is made and all that sort of thing.
This week's episode starts off with what's been going on in Formula One, which is definitely not about what's happening in the cars. It's the potential kind of power play that's going on with Christian Horner, who was involved in somebody alleging that he had conducted himself inappropriately, and there was an investigation. But actually, this is bigger than that. It's about the sport and its moving parts and its politics. And so we've been looking at that today.
I mean, we found, much to my surprise, actually how many times sport-related stories, which we obviously never look at on this show in a sport, in terms of the actual gameplay or whatever, but just how much actual intersection there is between sport and politics, increasingly so as well, and geopolitics.
Well, you look back to do you remember when Russia hosted the Winter Olympics?
Yeah,
right.
In Sochi.
This was Putin. Well done.
2014.
In his pomp and prime. No Olympic Games, winter or summer, has ever had more money spent on it.
Is that right?
That was an absolute kind of, we're going to throw the kitchen sink at this and make the world notice, obviously, that Putin is the most powerful demigod that the world's ever seen, and that was also has never had a Winter Olympics with more positive drugs tests. And most of those, there was a lot of Russian positive drugs tests that came after that. And Russia has been banned, obviously, from the international stage for a while now, related to those drugs tests in the kind of Summer Olympics. So that's all happens, I think, at a macro political level, and it feeds down into those sports. So there's so much, Lewis, that we can get stuck into.
I noticed that your co-host has done a runner.
Yeah,
Mark.
he's
where is he?
He's nipped back to Manchester, where he does a lot of his. So he didn't realise that you were coming down. Otherwise, I'm sure he'd have gone for a later train.
Well, rightly
but
so.
I'm
because
always hanging around.
Well, and rightly so, because as is our want on this show, when something nice happens, we like to have a little quiz. And now it's just going to be you. I've prepared. I spent ages this morning.
So some of these questions directed to Mark.
Not really. Well, it's interesting you say that, Gabby, because what I thought is like you say you're the sports agents. So it's just interesting just to see. As we've established, I don't know very much about sport, right? So I was just looking through various sports this morning and thinking about different trivia. So I just thought I'd just, you tell me whether you're going to be covering any of this stuff. And we'll
Okay.
Okay, so of course you will be aware of Holland's national sport, korfball. So I was just wondering if you knew how many players there are on a korfball team.
Korfball is the sport where they have this kind of scoop almost.
Oh, she's good.
Which scoops the ball up and you hold it and it looks like a large ice cream scoop, I think. Is that right?
What? Are you asking me? I don't know. You tell me, sports agent.
And I'm trying to think back if I've ever seen korfball played. I would say there are 5 players on each team.
Well, as a matter of fact, there are 4 men and 4 women on a korfball. So
there's actually 8. So it's mixed.
Well,
That's exciting.
Yeah, it is mixed. That is exciting, right? Now, what about this one? It's all right. Don't worry about that one. Korfball, it's probably not going to come up that much. Jose de Amazola is to date the only gold medal holder of which sadly discontinued Olympic sport?
You know, there used to be a writing.
I did know that, yes.
Gold medal.
That is a sort of loser thing I do know, yeah.
So he wasn't that.
No, he wasn't that, but it was around that sort of time.
We're talking early 1900s.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Can you say his name again so I can just pinpoint
Jose
exactly
de Amazola.
So I don't think he's from the Southern American region. I think he's actually Spanish.
Correct. I'd love you to get this right. It would be so good if you got this right. I'll give you a clue, okay? So there's 2 words to this sport, and one of them refers to a region of Spain.
Okay.
A sort of slightly unhappy region of Spain.
Okay.
As in they don't really want to be part of Spain.
Well, it's Basque, obviously.
Yeah, Basque, yeah.
Yeah. Not Basque et ball. This is this Basque something then. Basque tennis.
Basque pétanque. Oh. It's a great game, Basque pétanque.
So it's different to normal pétanque.
Oh, very much. It's Basque.
And how does this change the sport?
Well, it's probably done in the sun
with a lot of objections and people.
Well, yeah, exactly. No one actually wants to play it,
and everybody's protesting.
And occasionally gets violent. One last one. What is the name of the international governing body for handball? And can you tell me where this body is headquartered?
The international. So it's obviously an interesting acronym. The International Governing Body for Handball. Is it not just those letters, international government? It has a name that's outside of those initials.
I don't know. You tell me. I would have thought you would be fond. This is an Olympic sport, handball. Very big in continental Europe.
We don't play much handball in this country.
And it's a bloody shame as far as I'm concerned. So this is something
do you know
that is
where
your
handball
show.
Was played? I'm going to throw it back at you.
What you're doing now is deflecting, as you might do in several sports.
Do you know where handball was played at the London Olympics? Do you remember which venue
the Excel
it was?
Centre?
No. The Copper Box. It was played in the Copper Box. Do you remember the Copper Box?
I do. I still feel that you're deflecting about the international...
Buying myself time. I'm trying to think of the teams.
I'll give you... It's the IHF.
The IHF, International Handball Federation.
Correct.
And Headquartered in... I'm going to say it's headquartered in Copenhagen.
No. It's in Basel, in Switzerland. Oh. And just for your records, the next World Handball... and just for your records, the next World Cup is going to take place in Croatia, Denmark and Norway from the 14th of January to the 2nd of February 2025. So the countdown starts now.
I got one of the countries there.
And we didn't even get to go on. My Norwegian wife's going to be very disappointed. We didn't even get on to the Luge or Nordic combined questions, which is a big shame. So look, to be fair, they were directed for Mark, a lot of those questions, and he wasn't even here, and he left you to do it all on your own, which is very sad.
I can see that you're absolutely on the same page as us with sport, though, Lewis, from those questions.
Honestly, it is an absolute disgrace that I've not been invited onto more sports shows.
You will be.
I will be. Oh, yeah, and I should be. Remind us when it's going to be out every week.
Tuesday and Thursday, 5 o'clock. Of course, you can either listen after the sports agents.
Yep.
You can listen to the news agents first, then listen to the sports agents. You could do it the other way around. You can mix it up.
No one will do that.
Maybe on a Thursday, do sports agents first, then news agents. It's up to you.
As long as you do both. You can be a double 100%er, as we say. Gabby, best of luck with it. Can't wait to listen.
Thank you so much, Lewis.
I'm going to learn so much. I mean, I've got all the obscure sports down. I've got all that down, and I'm looking forward to learning about all the boring ones, the stuff that people like.
The boring ones that bring in the billions.
Yeah. Look, Bas Batank's big money. Gabby, thanks so much.
Thank you, Lewis.
It is going to be such a good show. Make sure you go and subscribe to the Sports Agents right now. If I'm listening, you all really have no excuse at all. We should have dedicated that, though, of course, to my favourite sportsman of the 20th century. News that Tony Green of the Hockey of Bullseye has died at the age of 85. Out of black and into the red. Nothing in this game for two in a bed. What a show.
You'll recognise the voice of Mr. 180! Tony Green.
We'll add that to the top of the list of popular culture references Emily hasn't got a clue about. She, the only girl in Sheffield in the mid-80s who almost certainly wasn't watching Bullseye. And we will be back tomorrow with loads of budget coverage and Jon or Emily with the results of Super Tuesday. I wonder what will happen. Bye-bye.
The News Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.